Hey everybody, welcome back to another stock analysis. Today we are looking at Protagonist Therapeutics. So they are a biopharmacy company which does multiple different therapeutic drugs. And essentially they are a very smaller, on the smaller side company. So definitely interesting. Biopharmacy is always an interesting sector as a whole. There's usually a very large dependence on government and regulations and things like that. So always a lot of large movements. So we're going to get into them today, look over their financials, go over evaluation, as well as some other things like their chart and their earnings. So if you're interested, make sure to subscribe. I make these videos just about every day of the week. And let's get into Protagonist Therapeutics. So getting into PTGX here, they have a few different products that they're currently developing. Looking at their market cap, they have $2.2 billion in value currently. So definitely on the lower end, which personally I always love because that just means there is so much upside to companies like this. And there is also a lot more risk. So the target price is currently at $57, almost $58 a share. And there is a positive long-term growth rate, although it's fairly low at 2.5%. Right now we're at $37 a share. So there is a lot of possible potential upside here, but we'll get more into valuations later. So looking at their chart, there is a lot of volatility here. They are clearly in a very recent uptrend, just about for the past year, where they went from right around $15 a share to $37 a share now. So there is definitely a strong momentum and growth going on in this company right now. And it does look like they're at a bit of the lower end of that uptrend currently. So could be an okay time to buy, possibly. So we will see in a little bit. Looking at their growth summary, they have a couple estimates up to 5 years, and the majority of these are very positive, including they are expecting a lot of sales growth within the next year, which is always something very good. They do not have the long-term 10-year estimates yet, but everything up to that looks very solid so far. Obviously, we want to see as many positive numbers as possible. So seeing the positivity here is the most important part. And now let's head into their financials and see what we can find out about the financial health of this company. So starting off, we have quarters. We are going to go into fiscal quarters, though, because I do not believe the company has been public for very long. This is their total chart, and we can see they went public in 2016. So going to the yearly view here really won't be the most valuable. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, maybe it will be. So let's check that out first. Looking into it, we can see over the past few years, okay, so they have had a decent amount of sales growth. It is a little bit inconsistent based on the quarters that we just saw for a moment. So they have 60 million in revenue. Over 2024, they have 320 million in revenue, which honestly is fantastic. And they actually apparently had a massive profit in 2024 as well. So that could be what is driving a ton of their growth recently. Now, will this be consistent? I'm not sure. But if we go back to the quarters, we can get a little bit more information on what's happening. And you can see here, there was a massive spike in their revenue in their first quarter of the year, where they made almost all of their sales. That also includes their massive amount of net profit that they made during that quarter as well. And one other thing, you could see that their total shares are steadily increasing. So there is a little bit of cash flow coming from that as well. But overall, we did see 2 straight quarters of profit for this company, which generally for younger biotech, biopharmaceutical companies like this one, we don't see a profit at all for a while. So seeing this is definitely promising. It's definitely more of a unique company in the space. So now let's go into their balance sheet and see what is going on here. So their assets have grown considerably over the past 2 years, basically doubling from around 300 million to 600 million now. They do have a lot of cash, and one very surprising thing here is almost no debt. They're at right around 11 million total in debt right now compared to their almost $500 million in cash. That is excellent. It puts them in a very healthy position, especially for possible acquisitions, which are very popular in this sector, as well as just cash flowing the company's development for seems like many years, especially considering they are making profit as well occasionally. So overall, they're in a very healthy position. Also, long-term investments saw a very large uptick in the past quarter, which is awesome. That definitely will benefit the company in the future. It gives them a lot more of a solid foundation for themselves. So everything here looks fantastic, especially highlighting that very low debt. Now moving on to cash flows, we can see, hopefully we will see a little bit of where that profit came from. And actually looking at the quarter coming from March 2024, where they did have the profit, they had a negative operating cash flow. So a lot of that comes from changes in working capital compared to their funds from operations. So although they did have a very large profit, they actually had a negative free cash flow as well as negative operating cash flow. So overall, from that profit, they did actually end up losing money through operations, it seems, which is a little surprising, but you could also see they essentially completely made it up the next quarter. So I believe what happens there is that a lot of that profit and revenue then bled into the next quarter and caused that very large operating cash flow, which would make sense, at least to me. However, I'm not sure if that's exactly how it works. It's a little bit too in depth and intricate for my expertise, unfortunately. But another thing you could see is the very large uptick in investments that they had recently, where they have been very largely investing since the September quarter of 2023. And it looks like they will hopefully continue to ramp that up. Definitely will provide a lot of growth for the company in the future. One last thing, their change in capital stock is consistently positive every quarter, which basically just highlights that they are, in fact, diluting their stock just about every quarter, which isn't great. However, I think if they can um, get these cash flows consistent and they continue to have at least profits on and off, even not even doesn't even have to be consistent, especially with a company like this. But I think they will then stop diluting their stock, which overall isn't the end of the world in the first place, but would be a positive to see. And then matching the operating cash flows up here, they do have 2 quarters of free cash flow positivity, which is awesome to see, as well as that one very large quarter in June 2024. So definitely a lot of promise here. And considering a $2 billion company had a $250 million in free cash flow in one quarter, that's honestly kind of shocking. You don't really see those kind of multiples and ratios very often. So just seeing those kind of numbers definitely has promise for this company being very, very below their fair intrinsic value. So if they can sustain this for any amount of time, really, their valuation will definitely blow up very soon. But we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. So now we can head into their ratios and see where they've been recently. So this will be a little bit shaky only because their quarters are so I don't even know the right word for it. Their quarters are very on and off, where their revenues are not consistent at all. So there won't be too much great information here. For example, I know for the past 2 quarters, it should be very, very different. And so one thing to note here, LTM means the last 12 months. So this is their September quarter plus the last 12 months as an average. So that is why they are consistently positive here. For example, that gross margin at 99% is what their average was. And that is including that very, very high quarter we saw earlier on their income statement. So that kind of explains why all these numbers look so good. However, one thing to definitely remember is that their quarters are very inconsistent, and this is an average of the last 12 months of those quarters, which I actually just recently learned myself. So definitely a good thing to know when you're looking at these kind of financial statements. But overall, gross margin being at 99 is insane. Even their SG&A to sales are fairly low, especially for a bio company like this. That's kind of surprising, to say the least. Operating margin is very high at 46%, net margins at 50%, which you don't see too often being higher than operating margins, but there are some situations where that can happen. With just receiving money from other funds or things like that. Free cash flow, we see that also being at a very high margin, and their ROA, ROE are also very positive currently, which is awesome to see. And moving down into their debt situation, you could see they do have negative equity, which does make sense. So we'll stick to the long-term debt to equity, where we could see 2% is basically nothing. That's not even worth mentioning, but of course I always do. But incredibly low, perfectly healthy debt situation. So absolutely no problems there. And now let's see if we have any earnings reports that we can look at. Sometimes with smaller companies, there aren't, but it looks like we'll have something. Unfortunately, they do not have fiscal year 2024 yet, which we do know by looking through it earlier that they don't have it, but they do have their most recent where they did surpass, it looks like they surpassed earnings estimates, and actually they surpassed very largely, where their revenue was 4.7 million, basically doubling the FactSet estimates. Research and development was also higher, which isn't great, but at the same time, you really can't go wrong most of the time with spending more on research and development. So that could be a positive thing as well. Anticipate a cash runway through the end of 2027. So, like I was saying earlier on their balance sheet, they have a ton of cash and very little debt. They are going to very easily be able to cash flow themselves, as we can see here, for the next 2 years just from their cash position right now. So, anticipating what will happen over the next 2 years, they should be in a very, very healthy position, which, again, with small companies in this sector, that's not something you see very often. It usually goes maybe quarter to quarter or very rarely farther than a year with their cash runway. So seeing this is definitely a very positive sign. And they do have a bunch of upcoming milestones for a lot of their drugs, which if you would like to read through this, I encourage you to. I'm sure there's a lot of promising things there, but I'm not going to go through everything. Let's now get into their valuation, which I was having trouble loading this earlier, but I think it should pop right up for me here. And we will see how they're doing versus some competitors. So we do actually have some valuations here. Unfortunately, not a lot of specific companies, and one of them has a very, very high PE ratio. So this isn't the greatest thing to base it off of. However, we could see the median here at 14.64. If these companies are similar, um, that would be a good thing. But overall, I think I will just base it on the fiscal year 2 of a couple more. Actually, there's one more company here. But overall, if we look at all of these numbers, they are higher than what Protagonist is currently at, which does point in the direction of the company being undervalued compared to competitors. However, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the PE ratios of these companies, which is strange because they are publicly traded companies. You can see their tickers right here. At least for some of them. Obviously, not all of them are, but overall, a little strange that we don't have too much information. But based on the numbers that we can see overall, they are in an undervalued situation just because their PE is lower on average than all of these numbers we see here. So there is some positivity there. And going back into their chart, I can really highlight that very strong uptrend that we have been seeing over the past year or so. And just looking at this, we'd see there is a channel that has formed just based on the multiple tops here that they have seen. And looking at this, we're looking at possibly a little bit more downside currently. However, there could also be a wedge situation going on just based on where these bottoms are. A little bit of a rising wedge possibly happening. However, this is a kind of a strange chart formation. It's not something you see too often, where there aren't a lot of tops and bottoms really matching up too well. I'm sure better charters than me would be able to find this out a lot easier, but overall, it looks pretty decent. We can get into the daily chart to kind of get a little bit of a better picture, and that definitely shows how this channel has been working out a lot better. So thinking of this as a support area, it could be heading back up to right around the $50 range, which would put it at that fair value that we saw earlier on FactSet. So if that does happen, that would definitely be very much worth a short to midterm trade. But overall, I think just with the health of this company and the developments that they've been making, I think completely it is a very solid company to do your own research on and definitely consider looking into more. But that's all I have for Protagonist today. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and I will see everybody in the next video.